First things first, I passed. Unfortunately, it came at a cost. That being that the stress of dedicated, it caused me to lose all my hair. Okay, I just decided to go for a fresh change of pace and get a haircut. But I have really been enjoying the second part of medical school and didactics being over and being in clerkships. And for those of you that are starting medical school, that are in didactics, there really is light at the end of the tunnel, and the second part of medical school is immensely better than what I had gone through my first 2 years of medical school. So there is light at the end of the tunnel, but really what I wanted to focus on before doing this conclusion was I really wanted to take some time to reflect on board studying and what I went through throughout this, 5 to 6 week period that I had for dedicated board studying. And so I also, before sharing this video, wanted to confirm that I had passed both my board exams. So, inherently the information that I'm sharing in this video wasn't just a whole bunch of smoke, and, I could talk from experience and also show that, the process I'd gone through allowed me to pass my exams, and it wasn't just a whole bunch of BS. So, full disclaimer is that, this experience of me going through dedicated and what I've learned through going through dedicated is, unique to me for step and level 1. And naturally, everyone has their own unique experience and approach to going through dedicated and board studying. So, that can be extremely involved, kind of like how my process was, or even marginally so. So, for example, on one end of the spectrum, so those people that are, kind of the top percentile test takers, board medical knowledge grandmasters, and, the people that really are able to take exams and just succeed. They're just really good test takers. And so I know people that, kind of fall in that category, and they did less than 10% of UWorld, past step and level 1. Hell, I even know someone that did less than 200 questions throughout all of dedicated for UWorld, and they also passed step and level 1. Now, I do consider those people to be more along the lines of exceptions rather than the rules. However, that being said, if you fall in that category and you happen to be a board medical knowledge grandmaster, more power to you. And by all means, coast through dedicated, take a practice assessment or two, make sure you're, good enough to pass step and level 1, and enjoy your time off. Because you really don't need to prepare for boards like the people that aren't in that category. And so there's no real need for you to, push yourself under the distress of grind mode board studying just for the sake of it. Take your exam early on and enjoy your time off. Now, for those of you, myself included, that really fall under the camp of, just not board medical grandmasters, the following recommendations are really going to be more geared towards you. And so I have a number of recommendations, and I just kind of want to go through them step by step. So firstly, be honest with yourself. Be honest with how long you need to take to prepare for your boards and how many questions you need to take to get there. So for me personally, I ended up doing a total of 5,200 board style questions. So that means all of board prep. So that's Amboss, UWorld, TrueLearn questions, as well as all of my practice assessments. So I did 1,100 questions of Amboss, 2,300 questions of UWorld, 80 questions of TrueLearn because I'm not a big fan of TrueLearn, and 1,800 practice assessment questions. So all in all, about 5,200 questions. Now, some people I know ended up taking step and level 1 about 3 weeks into dedicated because they had front loaded their studying throughout the semester, which means they didn't have as much of a gap to make up when it came to actually taking level 1 and step 1. So their starting point was higher, so they didn't have to take as long with dedicated. And other people I know actually took, well over 2 months to take their board exams because they either procrastinated, they couldn't find the motivation earlier on, or it just took them a lot longer to get their scores up to speed and get comfortable so their metrics were higher enough so they didn't have to just scrape by with passing. Now, secondly, this is something especially particular for us in DFW and me and my classmates. Schedule your exams 6 months out as close to the date as you can 6 months away. because especially here in DFW, we somehow are always short of exam days and locations. And a lot of people I know had to travel for their exams because the board spots or the exam locations, testing locations like Prometric and whatever the other one is, they filled up. And essentially, if you wanted to take an exam on a certain day, you had to travel. So I had people that went to Abilene. I took COMLEX in Dallas, but I had to travel an hour. But I ended up taking Step in San Antonio. And so I had a lot of people I knew that traveled for their exam just because they couldn't find a good date and location. And that's just the reality of, the DFW area. So if, you fall into that category and you talk to some of your upperclassmen and that's the case with where you are geographically, don't wait to schedule your exam. But if you need to reschedule your exam, there's a good chance you'll find a spot very close to your exam date. So, if you're a week out and you're like, well, I need to schedule it in a different city, or you're like, I need to push it back, there's a good chance that someone also moved their exam. So you should be able to find a location. That being said, it's not really great to bank on, finding that spot in the last week when you're already stressed with boards and there's already a lot of other things that are like weighing on you. So I wouldn't bank on that as being your guarantee for finding, your perfect date at the perfect location. But it is possible to find locations because a lot of people do actually end up moving their exams. And, additional costs if you are moving your exam or not, and you do have to take it in a remote location, Airbnbs, hotels, cost more money, and that's just another thing to add to your plate. So, when it comes to exams, do not be afraid to reschedule. I had scheduled my Step 1 to be on June 2nd. But I had to reschedule it because I had a personal schedule conflict, and that took precedence over me taking my board exam. Unfortunately, that means I had to push Step until the 17th, which was a week and a half back. And unfortunately, I had also scheduled other things. So my now wife and I had planned to do a civil ceremony, a little family get together, a little staycation, and then just take some time off before getting started with, clerkships. But because I had to move Step to the 17th, I took COMLEX. We went down to San Antonio. We did our civil ceremony, our family get together, and at our staycation, I had to study some. And then once we finished with our little staycation, I was studying basically night to day or morning to evening for Step, really early to late at night to, fill in those last minute gaps and grind at my in-laws' dining table, basically like 12-hour spells, which was not ideal. But that was just the reality of my situation. That was just the reality of the hand that, I had been dealt. And I really just had no choice but to adjust my plans. And so, it is important to be flexible and to, kind of go with the flow because you can't control everything. But I can't say that I don't wish that things would have been slightly differently and I would have been less stressed and had probably a better time enjoying the things that I had planned after COMLEX had I not had that exam looming after the staycation. So, in hindsight, things could have been different, but it is what it is. But ultimately, I think it's really important that you don't feel afraid to push your exam because failing Step or Level 1 has a greater deal of ramifications just to your entire career as a medical provider than the ramifications of spending a few $100s or $100 if you're closer, a little further out from the exam. And I know it feels steep. I know $100 or a few $100s is really steep and it's not something to take lightly, but I'm going to try and implore you to not think about the financial implications more than you think about your potential career implications if you do happen to fail the exam, because it's a lot easier to come back from, a few $100s than it is from failing Step in Level 1. So ideally just don't use the attitude of we ball and full send your exam when you're not ready just for the sake of it, because inherently that can potentially pigeonhole you into a residency program that you ultimately didn't want to get match into and potentially in a location you weren't interested in living in for 3, 4, or 5 years. So just food for thought when it comes to rescheduling your exam and just pushing it and waiting till you're at a good place, metrics wise, to take your exam. So thirdly, questions. And I know there's a really strong temptation to forego answering questions, especially earlier on in dedicated, in favor of doing more, hard passes on material like first aid, melon med, pathoma, especially when you get slapped around by UWorld constantly with just marks. And the number of times that UWorld slapped me with a 30%, a 40% was genuinely demoralizing early on. And had I not stuck with UWorld and done the questions, gone through the motions, and tried to learn from my mistakes, I would not have been able to markedly improve my averages and get my marks up to a point that really just ensured my ability to pass. And so by doing questions, I'm talking about UWorld question blocks, Amboss, TrueLearn, if you fancy that and you're really just focusing on COMLEX, and doing just as many practice assessments as you can fit in your dedicated period. So you're basically doing a practice assessment once a week, every week throughout dedicated, a few ideally before dedicated, so you get an idea of where your deficiencies are so you can focus on those, and then what you need to work on throughout dedicated so that way you can, fill in those gaps. And so by doing a practice assessment every week, you do your NBME practice assessment, your form number 30, 31, 29, whatever. And you review them maybe the next day, take some time off. It is kind of like a difficult experience going through, dedicated and taking those assessments. And, you have to allot time for those practice assessments. But really reviewing your incorrects on them gives you an idea of what you're doing wrong and where your gaps are. And it gives you basically like a bar graph, standard deviation, where you are, what you could improve on, and what subject matter that might fall into, be it, heme, cardio, renal, GIGU, anything like that. Now, I do have a really, really, really strong contempt for any assessment that only gives you a score and does not at all let you review your answers and mistakes, and that contempt is way, way too real. You know who you are. Stop withholding information. And remember that people are trying to learn, and how are you supposed to learn from your mistakes if you don't know what they were in the first place? You just see a bar graph. So if you do a practice assessment that doesn't have the ability to review afterwards, so NBMEs allow you to review, which is great. ComSays do not. And it's really just kind of going to hinder your ability to learn from your mistakes because you just see a number, you just see, oh, I passed or didn't pass. But being able to learn from those mistakes and being able to see and review and see where those gaps are is much more useful than just seeing a score. So using those practice assessments, the fourth point, using those practice assessments to gauge where you are and the progress that you're making. So do you actually need to do all the UWorld, Amboss, and TrueLearn questions? No, absolutely not. But you should do as many practice assessments as you can, as regularly as you can, so like on a weekly basis, so that way when you do get to the point that you're taking your exam, you know that the metrics that you're hitting are good enough for you to pass your exam. So for NBMEs, the typical recommendation is scoring above a 65% on 2 subsequent forms a week before taking the exam. So that could be week 3, week 2, or week 2, week 1 before you take your actual step exam. And so that way you're in a comfortable place to pass your exam. I've also heard of people using 60%, but I just personally use 65, and that's just kind of what I've used for me personally. So if 60 works for you, by all means, go ahead. Now for the free 120s, both the new and the old one, ideally you're shooting for a score above a 70%, and that's obviously before your exam, and that could be a few days, weeks, whatever. Now the UWorld self-assessments, so these are a little unique in the sense that assessment 1 is a good confidence booster that people typically see as one that's more correlated to their score, whereas 2 is just a confidence killer. So self-assessment 2 for UWorld is something you just want to if you want to motivate yourself or you just want to demoralize yourself, dealer's choice, take assessment 2 earlier on and then 1 later on, so that way you have an idea that you're at a good point for your studying. Now ComSays. ComStays, I would say the goal is to ideally hit a 450 on your ComStay before taking the exam. That's typically the metric that a lot of schools like to use for your, good chance of you passing. And I did 2 ComStays. I did the one our school offered, and I did the one I bought myself. And I mean, they're a good way to get a gauge for how they're going to ask questions in a COMLEX style exam. But they're probably my least favorite assessment, especially because you can't review those answers. Now, because those are practice assessments and not just blocks, I think when you're looking at UWorld blocks, earlier on, your percentages are going to be lower, and ideally you're bringing them up. So bringing them up. But at the end, you should be roughly shooting for about a 60% average on your exams and your blocks, 40 question blocks. That could be plus or minus 10% because there's so much ebb and flow in those blocks depending on the questions they pull, the gaps you have. You could score 50 on one, a 70 on another. Your average is still around a 60. So that's kind of where you should be I'd say for UWorld to pass comfortably. Amboss, typically 65 to 70%, TrueLearn 65 to 70%. And that's like to be at a comfortable point to pass. And I'm not saying early on and dedicated. I'm saying, later on, once you're really close to taking your exam, those are the marks that ideally you're getting closer and closer to hitting to be comfortable to pass. Now, Amboss versus UWorld. So I would say both of these resources, they shine for different reasons and they have different strengths and weaknesses. So in my experience, Amboss is a more complete learning package. So that being the Amboss integration with Anki, the question blocks you can create from Anki, the articles you have for basically every drug and disease state, the studying hyperlinks that give you links to read for different articles depending on certain buzzwords, the question hints that you can read that show you and highlight different points that you should pull from the question stem to learn, what you should focus on during that question stem. That just altogether, in my opinion, makes it a better learning resource than UWorld. That being said, UWorld is just a better question bank. It's a superior representation of what to expect from step 1 questions, from the higher order questions to the depth of knowledge you need for your pathophysiology to understand and answer questions at an appropriate level. And to top it off, the UI that you have for UWorld is basically identical to that of step 1. So you'll have the bonus of familiarity when you go into step 1 that the interface basically looks almost exactly the same. Now, fifthly, content review should ideally not be the bulk of your studying. It should really be more of a supplement to what you're doing with question banks. So for example, Pathomas chapters 1 through 4 are great. They're amazing for step 1. However, the problem is from then on, the other Pathoma chapters, they aren't pathophysiology deep enough and heavy enough for my liking to succeed at UWorld. They're much more surface level, so just big picture thinking. But when you're trying to answer questions in UWorld, you need a better understanding and a deeper understanding of that content to be able to answer those questions. So the first 4 chapters, by all means, read them, do Anki questions on them, the Duke decks, whatever. But when you're trying to do content review for, deep diving pathophys, first aid, and melon med. And I consider them kind of synonymous resources for pathophysiology heavy resource that you use for studying. But, first aid is one of those tried and true resources that plenty of students will lay their lives on, and they'll attest to they basically managed to pass because of first aid. Now, I know a lot of other people that they prefer using Melon Med because the way that they present their resources and their material for different subjects is there's questions kind of thrown in the middle of the subject that you're reviewing, so the content and the paragraphs or bullet points, and you have those questions that go in tandem to what you're looking at. So if you're looking at the pathophysiology for Lesch-Nyhan syndrome or homocystinuria, you can see questions that they may ask you in UWorld based on those disease states, and it gives you kind of a way to bridge the gap between, this is the pathophys of it, and this is how they might ask questions about it and how that patient presentation might be. Now, number 6, I think it's really important that you really take the time to properly review the questions that you take. So learn from your mistakes is probably one of the most important things you can do when you're doing questions and when you're doing your content review. So you get a question wrong, you get it consistently wrong over and over again, you make a note of it, you unlock the Anki cards, and you really focus on reviewing the questions and the content, so that way the next time you see something similar from the same vein, the same subject material, you get it right. And that's where it comes into play of like really deep diving into the answer choices, not just the correct answer choice that you got wrong or you got right, but also the ones that are, higher percentages. So probably not the 1%. That's okay. But let's say there's between two answer choices and one's like a 55% right and then a 45% right. Understand why that 45% was not the good answer choice, and understand why certain presentations and certain buzzwords, had they been thrown into the question stem, would have changed your answer. And so it's really important for you to be able to change your answers and be flexible with how you understand a question stem based on, the presentation. And so learning from your mistake is going to be one of the most important things when it comes to that. So when you're going through questions, you get them wrong, you get them right, really be honest with yourself and ask, did I miss part of the question stem that would have led me to the correct answer? Did I accurately identify the high yield information that was actually in the question stem and actually see what I needed to pull? Did I understand what the question was actually asking me and what they wanted me to answer? And then do I know the pathophysiology behind the concepts, or do I need to brush up on this a little bit more and actually focus on, a little bit more content review? And so if so, make a note of it, review it, unlock those cards. And then also when you're going through questions, did I actually eliminate the, really incorrect answer choices and narrow down, to 2 or 3 that were decent answer choices? So that way I ruled everything that was just entirely not it. And then I can rule in the right answer choices from the stuff I pulled out from the question stem. And so me personally, I'm a big fan of using the Anki UWorld incorrects, even to the point that I created about 400 of my own cards with UWorld tags for the Anki cards that just didn't exist with the Anki. I think I have Anki V11. And so I made my own cards for that, but I also know that Anki is not for everyone. And if Anki is not for you, don't force it. So, there's ways that you can study that content review and do that incorrect review without doing Anki. Make a note of it, make a study guide, do whatever works for you to fill in your gaps and what you've done thus far in studying, so that way you can build upon that. Just don't try and reinvent the wheel in order to fill those gaps. Now, number 7, it's really, really important that you trust yourself, and you trust yourself throughout the process. And I say this because this happened to me, this happened to a number of my friends, and countless of other people that have taken boards before me. The process of going through dedicated is a marathon. It's rocky, it's frustrating. There'll be plenty of times where you're steadily coasting, making progress, you're finding your groove, you're making breakthroughs, and then bam, you just get slapped in the face with like the worst series of blocks that you've ever taken. And those points and that point in dedicated really sucks. It's just not a great feeling that you just went from making consistent progress to just being slapped in the face with, no, you're not smart. And that's not it. That's not it at all. It's one assessment. It's a one block of 40. And that block of 40 doesn't define the progress that you've made thus far, that you're going to make throughout dedicated, and that you'll continue to make as you prepare throughout boards. It takes time to fill in knowledge gaps, and the more time that you take to, figure out UWorld and go through board exams and figure out what you need to look for in question stems, what you need to look for in answer choices, and what you need to focus on that those assessments are actually going to ask you about, that by the end of the day, that when you trust yourself, the journey, the process that you're going through, is that you'll be able to make it, that you'll be able to, see yourself through and succeed at the end of it. It's not always going to be a straight path. There's going to be ebbs and flows. It's not always going to be consistent and smooth sailing, and your graph will just be all over the place. But ideally, you're just going to be continuously trending upwards towards being successful. Now, on that note, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. There's no point in trying to reinvent yourself and the way that you've been studying for the past 1 or 2 years of medical school just for the sake of boards. trust what you've done to succeed thus far in medical school and build off of that. Yeah, you might need to make adjustments, you might need to make changes, but if you're not an Anki person, don't try to be an Anki person. If you really don't like first aid and Melon Med is your resource of choice, use that resource. It's not going to help you at all to try and use all these new different techniques and study methods because you only have so much time, and trying to constantly figure out a new resource and a new thing. There's so many different things out there. Pixorize, Pathoma, Sketchy, Anki, Onking, UWorld, Amboss, True. There's just way too many resources out there that you're going to lose yourself in trying to find the best resource while you're in dedicated, rather than trusting the ones that you've used thus far and trusting that they're going to be good enough for you. Now, with number 8, I think it's really important that you also be flexible and course correct as needed. So if you notice that you're consistently doing worse, that you just go through a spell where your scores and your marks just are constantly getting worse, or you're not making improvement at all, try to identify where those gaps are coming from. So are you pushing yourself too hard? Are you burning out? Are you not taking the time you need to properly review your questions after you take an assessment or after you go through a block of 40 questions? Maybe you're trying to rush through the questions to hit your goals of 4 blocks of 40 questions in a day. So you're trying to hit 160 questions in a day, every day, and you're not actually learning. You're just going through the motion of taking questions and going through those blocks. There are a number of different reasons that you may not be making progress, but obviously you know yourself best, and you'll know where you're kind of falling to the wayside, where those gaps are coming from. And, if you don't, ask a friend, ask them to, honestly assess what you're doing and assess where you may not be hitting the ball, where you not be hitting the mark as well. Because ideally, you want to spend as little time as possible spinning your wheels, because you just don't have enough time to just, mosey around and not make progress. Now, for me personally, I noticed early on pathophysiology and third order questions, I just didn't know how to think like that. Most of our exams thus far had really been first order, maybe a little second order, but they really weren't proper board style UWorld questions. And so I took it upon myself to start reviewing first aid a little heavier earlier on, to fill in the gaps and really focus on the segments and sections of first aid where I had gaps. So I wasn't reading chapter one by one. I was just focusing on, skimming through chapters and then, this is a question I know I got wrong. Let me really focus on this little section of this paragraph or this section of first aid, so that way I don't get these kinds of questions wrong moving forward. Now, regardless of what it is, try to, recognize it early on, nip it in the bud, and that way you don't derail your progress, for the sake of the grind. So don't just push yourself through it just so you can keep grinding and keep on grinding, because that's not going to necessarily help you proceed and move forward with your dedicated, period, and succeeding at taking level 1 and step 1. Now, lastly, number 9. So board prep and board studying it's an extremely taxing time. It's likely to take a significant toll on your mental capacity as well as your physical and mental well-being. And while there are definitely ways to increase, your chances of passing and reduce the weight of the toll that you have to pay, to pass your board exams, it's really important to recognize that, where you're starting and when you're starting to burn out, and not try to push through that barrier, because ultimately that'll do more harm than good. If you need to sleep and you're not consistently getting enough sleep throughout boards, you're going to see that you're not hitting the marks, or that you're just not making the progress that you need to at a good time pace. So really being honest with yourself and taking the time for yourself, to take care of your well-being is going to be, pertinent to you succeeding when it comes to dedicated and your career as well. So, for me, one of those things that I focused on was keeping a consistent gym schedule with one of my best friends from school. So we would study from early in the morning till 5 p.m. We'd work out, go home, and then study some more, rinse and repeat. And so that routine helped me have some built-in break time for myself to disconnect from grinding, to just give myself some reprieve, and then be able to hit the evening study session a lot in a much better mental space and a much better physical mental well-being capacity that otherwise if I had tried to push through, from 8 a.m. until 10 p.m., I would have just been dead. And so, whether it's walking your dog, getting some fresh air, cooking, baking, spending time with your family, try to build in that time for yourself every day to just really take some time for yourself and just step away. Because dedicated board studying it's a marathon operation. And keeping your head held high is essential to you, coping with the stresses that are inherently closely tied with step 1 and level 1, and just this grueling experience that just is dedicated board studying. When it comes to board studying, confidence is a fickle thing. And the week before your exam is when stress really starts to ramp up and you start to think, okay, I'm here. I'm a week out from my exam. And I feel like I haven't done enough. I feel like I haven't, done what I needed to do or filled the gaps I needed to fill to actually be in a place where I can succeed at this exam. And I remember I happened to be walking Shiro and my mother called me, she just asked me how I was doing. And up until that point, I hadn't really thought about how I was feeling about, my exam being a week away. But all of it just hit me at once. I started to feel like I was overwhelmed, that I hadn't done enough for my exam, that I had way too many gaps to fill between, the week I was out for my exam and my exam date, and that I just wasn't going to be ready. And like that emotional place that I had actually just had a little bit of time to reflect on, it was just not great. And I basically was at a point where I almost felt like I was about to start crying, and it was just not a very great vulnerable position to be at where I was a week out. And I had to get myself out of that headspace because I had done enough. And I promise you, a week out from your exam, you have done enough. You have prepared yourself, you had filled your gaps, you have really done your due diligence in order to prepare yourself for the exam, and you will just inherently feel stressed, but it's okay. You will be okay. Just make sure to take the time to just breathe, take the time to get yourself out of that headspace, and to just actually think about what you've done thus far and accomplished over the past few weeks. And inherently, you have done enough. So I know it doesn't feel like it, and I know it won't feel like you're going to succeed, and there are going to be constantly reminders of, oh, you didn't do this right, or you didn't do this right, or you got this question wrong. But it's okay to be overwhelmed. Just don't let that define how you're progressing through the last week of your dedicated, and don't let that define how you're going to see out the exam, because confidence is so important going into step, so important going into level 1, and making sure that you approach those exams with the utmost confidence possible is going to help you so much more than not being in the right headspace and not being in the right mental space. So if you're feeling overwhelmed, take a step back. If you don't have enough time to get your practice assessment marks to the point where you need them to be, move your exams. Do not be concerned about moving your exams. It's okay. So many people do it. You're not a failure if you move your exams. If you move your exam and you succeed, you did what was best for you, and you did what you needed to do in order to succeed. And that's all that dedicated is about, is giving yourself a platform to succeed and giving yourself a platform to put your best foot forth, both confidence-wise, knowledge-wise, and otherwise. If you're feeling isolated, don't forget to reach out to your friends and family. I know they want to give you the space to be successful, but at the same time, they're there for you, and you have your network and you have your inner circle there for a reason. Don't feel afraid to use them. You also have your fellow classmates and your friends that are going through this experience with you as well. And better than anyone else, they know at that exact moment what you're going through because they themselves are going through that as well. So reach out to your friends, reach out to your inner circle, and confide in the people that you have that are closest to you that can help you gain perspective. They may not be able to help you study. They may not be able to give you the answers, but they're there for you, and they're there to support you, and they're there to help you through, the times that is dedicated, and that's such a stressful time period. So don't forget to use them. Don't forget to take time for yourself, and don't forget to just breathe. Now, switching gears and thinking about what I would have done differently. So, hindsight 2020, and honestly, my only regret for dedicated and board studying is I wish I would have done all of my Amboss blocks prior to my systems classes being done. So, GI, GU, MSK, Neuro, all of those classes, I wish I would have finished the blocks for Amboss for. So that way, when I went into dedicated and I had my dedicated period starting, my starting point would have been much higher than what it was when I started dedicated not doing that. So using that as a supplement for my actual classes would have allowed me to kind of double dip. So I'm doing practice questions for my didactics and I'm learning, but I'm also doing board style questions to supplement, course studying and also preparing myself. So that way, when I do get to dedicated, I'm setting myself, a little further ahead. And so front loading and, board prep studying, they go tandem in your academic coursework. And so I ideally, when realistically could have finished dedicated earlier on, had a much more sizable vacation, had a good amount of time to really reset before going into clinical rotations. But woe is me. And honestly, I just paid the price for not front loading. And that falls on me. So learn from my mistakes. Ideally, if you want to take less time for dedicated and board studying, front loading is probably the best way to do it. And then just being honest with how much time that you're going to need for dedicated and board studying. So that way you plan your vacations, your R&R accordingly. Like I mentioned earlier, the Excel spreadsheet that I made for UWorld, I will be sharing. This is the one that I created. This is the one that I use for dedicated. So I have all my UWorld incorrects, the does not exist, corrects, incorrects, the exam number that I took, and then where I was at the end of dedicated. So scoring roughly about a 60% on my assessments and blocks of UWorlds by the end of it. And this is basically how it's all set up with the different practice assessments and the total number of questions that were done. And ideally, this will help you get an idea and understanding of how far you are, how much you need to do in order to get through UWorld. So basically, you fill in anything that's in the white or the yellow, and you just go through this process and get an idea of how many questions you need to do in order to hit a certain percentage. So if, my exam date is, for example, August 20th, 2023, I have 30 days for my exam left. I need to do 64 questions per day to get to 60% complete. And to hit a certain percentage or to hit a certain percentage with certain questions or number of questions answered, I just plug and chug. And this will give you an idea based on how many questions you've answered, how much you actually need to do for dedicated. And so this will be a link. It's a Dropbox link that I'll put on the YouTube video. And this will also help, ideally, you figure out where you're progressing, how you're progressing, when you're having those kind of dips in performance, and, when you need to course correct. And now I am finally officially done with Step and COMLEX, which means I can finally suspend all of these cards. Oh, that is beautiful. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't done so, good, please like the video or subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next one. A bientôt.